I want to do a quick sound check before we get the session kicked off. If anybody that's on the line already, if you wouldn't mind just doing a quick chat or question that the audio is coming through clear, that would be great. Again, we want to do a quick audio check just to make sure everything's coming through good.
Ready.
All right, good. Excellent. The audio is coming through clear, so that's wonderful. Bear with us 1 second. I want to thank everybody who's jumped on a couple of minutes early. The session is not obviously live just yet. We're just going through a couple of technical setup items. We have to get the recording set up before we get everything going. We also want to do a quick confirmation using the question or the chat function that the slides are currently up on everybody's screen and that everybody is seeing those as well. So we can get a quick confirmation on that. Then we can go ahead and get the session kicked off. Great, thank you everybody. We appreciate that. We got a confirmation that the slides are showing, which is wonderful. So we're going to do a brief pause and we are going to come back on, and once the recording is started, we will go ahead and get the session going. Figure it's going to be about 45 minutes, probably from start to finish. We want to encourage everybody to ask as many questions as you'd like. And if we don't get to a question throughout the session, that's okay. Usually we'll get to those right at the end where we'll read out the question. We won't read the name. We won't read the the name of the person or the email or the company of anybody who's asked it. We'll just kind of read the question out. So we're going to do a brief pause, and then we're going to come back. I'm going to go ahead and get the session kicked off in about 30 seconds. So Randy will go ahead and start in about 30 seconds. Brief pause. Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's session, ensuring successful technology selection for scientific laboratories. Today's session is going to go about 45 minutes from start to finish. Before we get into today's session and introduce the speaker, I want to take a moment and just introduce the company who is going to be presenting today with Astrix Technology Group. So we can go next slide, please. Randy, you with me? We can go next slide, please. There we go. Perfect. So real quick, company snapshot. Who is Astrix Technology Group, and why do we have the right to be talking to you today about these topics? First and foremost, we are a group of informatics professionals who provide professional services. We're a company who's completely dedicated to servicing the scientific community with scalable, sustainable solutions. Some of the quick statistics of Astrix are: the company was established in 1995. It's privately held today. It originated as actually an IT division of a company called APBI, which was at the time a $300 million life science research organization. Today, Astrix operates from 8 offices and has over 500 employees globally. The headquarters are in Red Bank, New Jersey, and it has a professional services division, which is presenting to you today. This group is focused solely on supporting science-based organizations with their technology selections, technology training, implementation services, etc. Astrix also operates a complete scientific staffing division that offers both private as well as public staffing of scientific and IT resources. Again, highly focused around the scientific community. Next slide, please. There's a certain approach that Astrix takes. In fact, we brand it the Astrix approach, and it's essentially based upon a three-section cycle, if you will, of planning, implementation, and managing. It's essentially meant to help deliver digital transformation to the lab through end-to-end professional services. Again, we provide resources near shore, onshore, in your facility that helps with the planning, the full implementation of, and then the post-implementation management of the technology that's meant to run the modern laboratory today. And fortunately, we have somebody with us today in Randy Heiss who is extremely experienced. Randy, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you, and if you can go ahead and advance that slide, that'd be great. A little bit about the speaker for today. Randy has developed laboratory workflow analysis in 1988 while at Digital Equipment Corporation, and he's developed techniques that have been presented at various conferences in North America, Europe, Asia, as well as South America. He's been a Scientific Computing magazine monthly columnist and was part of that editorial board from 1996 through 2016. There's certainly more information you can get on Randy. Either just Google Randy Heiss as well as Randy Heiss workflow analysis, and you'll get a wealth of information about him. But obviously, we're thrilled to have him part of the Astrix family and community, and also thrilled to have him talk to you today about this topic. I'm going to go ahead and just pass it over to you now, Randy. Hopefully you're ready to get rolling here, and you can take us through the rest of the presentation. I'll be on to wrap us up at the end.
Thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm glad you could attend today. Just to reiterate, this is part of a series of webinars that Astrix is presenting, and we talked earlier about, in a previous webinar about addressing LIMS deficiencies. So focusing on companies that had current LIMS systems and so forth, but they needed to either be beefed up or they needed to be modified in some way, looking at new requirements for the existing system. The approach we're taking today is going one step farther. So where we looked at upgrading legacy systems in the past and re-engineering your current legacy system, today we're going to take the step for those companies that are purchasing and migrating to a very new LIMS system. And so the process is somewhat complex, but we try to make it understandable and very linear. Just a word about the Astrix approach, and this is very critical to understanding the strategy that we take. I'll be contrasting this strategy against some other strategies out there and so forth, but this is one that's kind of time-tested and works very well for our customers. We start with a current state workflow analysis. This is a comprehensive model that we go in and interview customer work groups, and by work group, what we're talking about is something like in-process testing, raw materials testing, microbiology, QA review, those kinds of things. Those are all work groups. And what we do in these cases is, to put it lightly, is we do all the heavy lifting. Customer resources that comprehensively understand these particular divisions, usually made up of bench-level analysts or supervisory personnel or so forth that are very fluent with the operations, come in and sit down, and all we do is explore what they do for good or ill. And we make no judgments. We want to try to figure out what the current state, how it exists, how it's being executed. We just need to understand the reasoning and logic behind all operations that are being conducted. What's interesting about the as-is process is that we've never failed to conduct one of these where somebody at some point during the as-is process says, wow, we didn't know how screwed up our workflow was until we see it. And that's what looking at something in workflow format and a tool like Visio does for you. Everybody can read a flow chart, and by seeing your operations for the first time come up and hit you in the face, and you can see how inefficiencies just sort of are magnified and come to the surface. So we do this by getting those work groups and representatives of the work groups in the room. We actually diagram the processes in real time on a whiteboard. This is in contrast to how we've seen other companies do it, where they try to fire up fancy tools or Visio or something like that. And what that ends up doing is wasting a lot of time. It's much slower to try to use a tool to develop the workflows. So we develop them on a whiteboard. And with the technology available with today's digital cameras and so forth, we capture the workflows in real time. It allows us to edit the workflows when people forget things, want to add things on the fly. So what we end up with is a pretty good model. We capture those workflows, we render them into Visio off-site. Shouldn't want to waste our customers' times in rendering Visio while we're sitting there under the roof. So what we do is we take these models off-site and we render them into beautiful Visio diagrams that are very, very easy to read. So in that case, all we've done is we've captured the current state environment. Now, when you're doing this for a number of work groups, it can take a little bit of time. We generally allocate about 2 hours per work group, but it could take that time. It could take an hour longer, usually not much less than that. But what we're trying to do is really get down into the detail. And I think a lot of people who go through this process, they're amazed at the amount of detail that we get into, but there's a reasoning behind that. The reasoning is we know what the end objective is. Not only are we going to try to get to a future state model, but one of the problems that we see, and this almost invariably happens with every customer we work with, somebody comes into the meetings with workflows saying, well, look, we've already done these workflows. We don't have to sit through this meeting. Here's the workflow for our raw materials department. But the entire raw materials department will be represented in 6 boxes on one piece of paper. That's not nearly enough detail that we need to get to the future state environment and get to the level of requirements necessary to be able to help you, the customer, differentiate between the various commercial LIMS out there. If you don't get down to the proper level of detail, then all LIMS looks the same. And so we want to avoid that. And plus, we want to get down to a level where we're designing a workflow that fits your environment. And we'll get into that in great detail in just a few minutes. Once we get into the future state environment, we don't do this in a group setting. We do this off-site, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, just because of the nature of our work and the fact that we've been doing it for decades and so forth, we're familiar with what commercial LIMS systems bring to the picture. We're also familiar with how LIMS vendors are advancing their products, and we understand the modifications, the enhancements they've made, new architectures, cloud hosting, and those kinds of things. We understand that comprehensively. But another thing is that when we're developing a future state model as a straw model, this is going to be something that we're going to present back to you, the customer, to review in advance of us coming back on site and discussing these things in detail, is that we've seen many, many campaigns. We've been through a lot of battles with LIMS implementations, and we've seen how customers with innovation and creativity have implemented these systems. Once we get done with the 2B models and everybody signs off on them, and usually when we go back in to review 2B models, what happens is there is a certain number of modifications, additions, deletions, and so forth that we make. But when we get to the final model, everybody signs off and says, you know what? This is the best possible way for us to work. Those future state models are also in Visio, and I'm going to show examples of those in a few minutes. But again, everybody can understand a flow chart, and by looking at the future state model, everybody's on the same page. It gets really interesting when we get into harmonization activities, because when we're in a multi-site project, we're frequently dealing across not only just different campuses within the United States. In many cases, we're working across different countries. We'll talk about harmonization at length in a bit, but generally speaking, we want to try to consolidate the requirements and the design of the system to a common model that, for the most part, services all of the member sites that are part of the harmonization effort. So we'll talk about the logic and the wisdom behind that, and also some of the challenges. By the time we get that 2B model completed, and we'll show you how we extract LIMS requirements out of it, we are able to pull the requirements that fit back, again, to the future state model. And remember, the future state model, even though it might be harmonized, it also reflects improvements to the workflow that may have nothing to do with the LIMS system whatsoever. Because we often see things in terms of efficiency in a customer site that aren't working well, and I'll talk about some examples of that. But what happens is that we want to be able to get the requirements documented and linked back to that future state model, which, as you recall, links back to the current state model, because that's how we got there. Vendor selection then occurs on fluency with the requirements that were extracted from the 2B model. Now, this is in direct contrast to how a lot of vendors conduct projects and design them. I had the opportunity to work for a vendor of a laboratory information management system twice in my career. And what the belief is under the roof of a vendor's house is that they believe that they've developed the best workflow out there for the flow of their product, and that you should fit your operation to their workflow because they understand how things should work. And really, We've never seen a garden variety workflow that applies to all customers. So what we want to do is make sure that we're evaluating the performance of vendor products to fit the workflow that we've all agreed upon in the 2B environment. And so in the 2B environment, since we've defined how we're going to work in the future, we want to now see how the vendors stack up against one another to answer those requirements. So finally, the project design falls out of the vendor selection and the 2B workflow. The 2B workflows serve as a guidepost for the developers because they already see now how things are going to operate in what sequence and so forth. And so that when we do the project design, we also will understand the priorities of the project, where these tasks come into play, and what have you. And they all reflect back to that future state model. Again, it's all based upon an agreed upon business model that everybody has said this works best for us. So from an Astrix standpoint, we have a few observations here. A lot of organizations try to select a system without first performing the due diligence required to align laboratory functional needs with the strategic needs of the business. This is why when we go in, before we even start current state workflow analysis, we get upper level management in the room and we just say, we're going to talk about this from 30,000 feet and start descending down to the surface. And I'll have a few more words about that in a moment. One remarkable artifact in having done this for decades is that very, very few businesses that are getting ready to jump into a major LIMS campaign, sometimes involving millions of dollars, sometimes involving dozens of sites and hundreds of users, they fail to capture a pre-project baseline for what it is that they're trying to do. The first question I ask when I meet with senior management of a company is, why are we here today? What made you think that you needed a new LIMS? And sometimes the answer is not clear. And what we're trying to do is get away from intuitive feelings, gut feelings that we just need a new LIMS. Our old one is getting long in the tooth. We have too many systems across too many sites. I mean, we're looking for substantial information on that. But we also want to understand, how's the company growing? Where are you going to be as a company in 3 years, in 5 years? Because that affects the decision process. So the first step in any kind of technology selection project should always be a thorough business process analysis. You don't know where you can get to till you understand where you are. And one thing that we say about business process analysis, it's about laser-targeted requirements, and it's also about process optimization. We want to try to get to the point where everybody has a common frame of reference and understanding where we are and where we're going. Continue on with the Astrix approach. We look at business process improvement by creating an optimized future state. You know, it's not us that have designed all of these future state environments from scratch. We've observed how a lot of we're trying to mine the collective creativity of a lot of our customers who have had really successful implementations. We pick up ideas from them every once in a while. If we work with you, we're going to pick up ideas from you as well. Now, we bring our expertise to the table as well. We've been through these things, whereas a lot of customers may have resources under their roof that have done maybe 2 or 3, even 3 LIMS systems in their career, maybe at different sites and those kinds of things. We've been through, literally among our staff, hundreds. And so we have this vast body of knowledge to draw from in terms of understanding how current commercial systems are applied to companies and how they're best used. It's also where we make suggestions sometimes back to the vendors and saying, you know what, we're hearing a groundswell of demand for cloud computing. We're hearing a demand for a really nice footprint on a tablet device to be able to use in-house and so forth. These kinds of things, we're involved with a lot of the commercial vendors in many cases, and they sometimes come to us and look for us to provide ideas for improvement to their product. So, as we said, not all business process improvement comes from software. Some of it comes from looking at inefficiencies in an operation. We've been to sites before where we'll go to one site and raw materials, as an example. When they get raw materials in the loading dock and they're getting ready to log them in, somebody gets on the phone and they call somebody from the lab. And they say, hey, get up here. We got raw materials. Come in and sample these for us. Well, what happens is when the lab people come and sample raw materials and finally get these logged in and put into the system so they're available for use. The labs have no idea that testing is going to be required until those samples are delivered to the lab. When we look at business process improvement, what we try to look for is ways of giving the lab as much advanced knowledge as possible. Advanced knowledge is good. You'll be surprised, and everybody out there was probably going to know of an instance within your organization where we call them kind of cynically ambush samples. Labs don't know the work is coming until a window opens up, a table is populated with samples, some bins have samples loaded in them. They happen to walk by after a half an hour and see these things and go, wow, there's work to do. That's not good, because you look at all the prerequisite activities that happen in the testing world, and many of them involve reagent preparation, instrument equilibration, labeling of glassware, labeling of containers, and so forth. Is if you can fill in dead space in a day with those kinds of activities, getting things up and ready to run, and then when the samples actually hit, you can get moving right away and hit the ground running, well, that's a good thing. And all I've just described, with some minor exceptions, are improvements that you can make by just logging in the samples at the raw materials side. If the raw materials folks or a person in that group was able to log the samples in, and since you know the testing that's going to be required of those raw materials, it's already known, as are the limits, the analyses, and those kinds of things. You know what groups that they're going to be distributed to microbiology, to raw materials testing. If you know all that in advance, why not let the labs know in laboratory backlog that this stuff is coming? Give them some time to prepare. So what happens is, the final result's an effective business process analysis that we conduct. We derive a set of future state requirements that will be used to guide all aspects of the project. It guides the IT architecture, in some cases, the technology and hardware selection. It helps us to prioritize tasks. Not everybody implements a LIMS in a big bang theory. You don't just suddenly turn on the system and implement every function across all sites. So doing this process allows us to figure out the optimal way to implement the project. I talked a little bit about the approach that sometimes vendors use, and I'm not meaning to demonize vendors, even though I have a demon in this picture. What I'm trying to say is the devil's in the details. So sometimes if a vendor believes that you should fit your processes to their workflows, there's a couple of reasons for doing that. I've heard the saying when I've sat in meetings representing customers where a vendor will say, you know what, we don't implement your system as much as we mentor you how to implement the system. Okay, so what person in charge of a budget, what person in charge of project ownership doesn't believe that to be an intoxicating message? Scott Adams, who I just threw up a Dilbert cartoon a couple of minutes ago, well, he's done a lot to run consultants into the ground sometimes. What we're talking about here is that sometimes customers are in the worst possible position to figure out how to implement a system because they don't have as much experience with the systems. Consultants do in general. So when a vendor is saying, look, we're going to teach you how to implement the system, what a customer is hearing is, wow, we won't have to pay as much for consulting. We'll have a whole bunch of people trained how to implement the system, and all is going to be good with the world and we're going to save a ton of money. But what a vendor may be thinking there is, look, we can get right to the deployment right away. We can get resources billable, get them working on the development of the system, and get moving. But what usually happens in that kind of case is that planning is downplayed. And that's not a good thing, because I've literally been in sites where vendor resources come in and ask the customer, what should we do today? Well, a customer may say, well, you know, we have these reports from our old system. Can you just do these today? Sure, we can do that. And what happens is LIMS, like a lot of complex systems, often take a long time to fail. So you might be 6 months deep into a project before you figure out, you know what, we really messed up the configuration of sample receiving. We kind of really blew it on how to best do work assignment. We need to go back and rework that. Well, if a vendor's implementing that system with deployment resources, the meter is still running. There's no problem that time and money can't solve. We think a little bit of planning up front prevents a lot of agony and suffering in the tail end, because once you bought the system and you're into it, it's not so easy to just get rid of it. So risk is sometimes passed to the customer by implementing what the customer said they wanted to do, rather than go through a process of figuring out what's best to do for the customer. So when we just electrify current state environments, whether they're making a duplicate of a current legacy LIMS into the new LIMS, or whether implementing paper-based reports and those kinds of things. There's an old joke about Boston. Having spent a lot of time in Boston during digital equipment days, if you've ever driven around Boston, you'll see the roads curl around and run into one another. They go up and down the hills. That's because in the old days of Boston, they just paved over the cow paths, meaning they didn't improve the infrastructure. What they did is that they just paved over the paths that the cows had beaten down. So you didn't really do anything innovative. You didn't do anything to improve the process. What you did was you made the old paths a little smoother. We're trying to get away from that because, in essence, if you just pave over cow paths, there's no process improvement taken into consideration. You're just going through and electrifying bad processes. We want to prevent that because you're getting into a situation where you're investing a lot of time and money and resources into a major project. So why just duplicate what you have? Since you implemented your old LIMS system, there have been a lot of process improvements that have been made. A lot of improvements have been made to vendor systems. A lot of innovations have come to light. So why not exploit those and see if they can be applied to your organization? We also believe that planning avoids scope creep. If you're going along and just implementing bad processes, eventually you're going to discover that certain things aren't working properly. You're going to go back and rework. And as I said, the meter is always running. So when we think about technology selection at Astrix, we, as I mentioned, like to come in and meet with high-level management and understand why are we here today, what are the project goals, what do you want to be when with the company in 3 years from now or 5 years from now. This all happens before we do any kind of business process analysis. What that means is that we're understanding the customer's objectives, and we want to understand what kind of resources and we want to make sure that the customer understands just what they're getting into. If we go into a site and we hear say, this is visible, we want to do this right, and we say, great, what kind of resources are you going to apply to it? And they mean by that. Well, we'd like you to identify a super users in the lab, somebody that understands lab operations, but also understand software. They have a good aptitude for working with software. We're not going to turn them into programmers. We want them to be the first level of defense. And so by doing that, when our professional developers come in and help you with your project, we want them to be available to understand why we're doing the things we're doing and also to be able to develop some skills. Well, if a customer comes back and says, well, they have their own jobs to do, we can't really afford to do that. They'll just have to make time at the end of their day to pick it up as they can. Well, we know that that's not the level of commitment that's going to lead to a successful project, so we'll push back on that, right? So when we're capturing current states on whiteboards and we render individual off-site, it's a quick way of gathering what we need to know about a group at just precisely the right level in about 2 hours per work group while we're on site. Usually we're a lot more tired than the folks that are sitting down because we're just asking them at this point to describe what they do. People know what they do. Sometimes they gloss over a lot of details because it's so intuitive, it's so second nature to them. What we're doing is drilling down kind of like a prosecuting attorney. We want to know exactly what they're doing and when they did it. So we want to trace not only data, but paper forms being passed around. We want to know what's happening and why it's happening. From a future state model perspective, the future state models are designed to eliminate wait states and inefficient redundant processes. They actually end up driving the requirements. So you'll hear me harping on it quite a bit that we're looking to improve the entire complexion of a customer environment and not just to say, look, we're going to try to find the best LIMS to dump you into and let the chips fall where they may. We're going to look at inefficiencies and make suggestions to you. Not all customers take all suggestions. That's fine. All we're trying to do is we're being asked to come in to help, and we want to be a full-service consultant agency to you, so that when we come in, we're going to say, look, and it's our opinion that you could really make life a lot easier for the people, say, downstream in the laboratory testing environment by doing A, B, and C. And sometimes that means that you'll make operational changes that actually create work for some people. In my earlier example, I talked a little bit about raw materials. I said, hey, let's get the raw materials folks who just used to get on the phone and make a phone call to the lab and say, hey, come get your samples. In this case, we're actually having raw materials people log in samples, generate labels, label containers or bags or whatever, maybe have to do some sampling from bulk containers and those kinds of things. But they're actually working and interacting with the LIMS. Well, you might get some grousing about that. You might get some folks saying, look, I thought this system was supposed to make life easier. You're just adding work to our pile. But in the greater good of the company, what we're doing is we're giving those labs that advance notice. We're giving them a chance to be prepared prior to those samples arriving. We're giving them a chance to fill in the white space in their day. So they have time where they're normally sitting around. I mean, there's no sense having people sit around watching HPLCs run and chug samples through them when if they know that, hey, in another couple of hours, the more samples are coming in, we can be getting other things ready. If they're microbiology people, they know that they got to start slapping labels on dishes and plates and those kinds of things. So by giving them some ability to fill in that white space in their work environment, we're going to make the customer more productive, and that's always a good thing. If we go back to my original slide where I said few people and few customers go through and establish baselines, if you've gone through and established a baseline, like how long does it take from the time a sample shows up to start the process now of labeling things, about labeling subsamples and aliquots, about now getting the reagents picked out of the cabinet, about preparing mobile phases and things like that. Now, if we clock this down and in a spreadsheet, we look at the process improvement once we implement the future state LIMS environment, and you see a 20% increase. Well, that's fantastic. I mean, look at how much better and how much more productive you can be if you picked up 20% of the time by optimizing the processes. So that's an example of what we're looking for. We're not just looking to get people in to start developing a LIMS implementation, a deployment, without thinking about what we're doing. We're thinking about improving life within the company, improving the processes overall. So requirements are derived from future state workflows. Remember, I will keep referring to the lineage. We started out with understanding the current state environment. We went to a future state environment that everybody agreed to, and they agreed to it at an abstracted level. What I mean by that is we get people away from saying, well, you know, when we push this button in our current system, this screen comes up and we do that. Well, we want that. And we just go back and say, let's talk about what's generating this need in the first place. You know, how did you get to that point? What we're doing that, and we did that as a defense mechanism. This is really important when you're harmonizing a lot of sites and so forth, because you often get conflict between sites, and we're conflict resolution artists. So what we're trying to do is come in and get things up to a level where nobody can cling on to a piece of pet functionality in the current system or cling on to a spreadsheet that they've used for 15 years, that they will not let go from their cold, unless it's their cold dead fingers and so forth. We want to make sure that we understand, why are you transcribing things from this spreadsheet to this sheet? Why are you doing this? Well, because, you know, we need these calculations and so forth. And so we drill down into that level of detail and challenge the thinking behind some processes. So we talked about harmonization. It's more than just a touchy-feely kind of thing. Harmonization is actually absolutely required in today's modern LIMS world. What's the modern LIMS world? Those folks that go back a few decades can remember that the entire LIMS landscape was populated by client-server systems. So client-server systems, they operate in silos on each different site. I was working with a large pharmaceutical company many years ago, and they had a desire to do this, to execute the same work processes the same way across multiple sites. It was a desire, but it was not a requirement, because, you know, as much as they could try to get things to kind of look the same at different sites, each site had their own system. Well, in a harmonized world, and when we're dealing with centrally served or cloud-served applications, and you're accessing those applications from web browsers, people are operating off one executable engine. So to the extent possible, you want to consolidate the processes so all sites are doing things basically the same way. But we found out that when we consolidate these methods and across multiple sites, we'll find out that there are nuances at certain sites and I'll show an example in just a minute, but that we have to accommodate in some cases. But for the most part, there's a lot of wisdom in harmonizing. And we've also found, and again, somewhat cynically, that harmonization in some terms is almost a diplomatic process more than a technical one sometimes. If one site comes in and tries to bully another across the geography or across the country borders or something like that, there's a lot of resentment. There might be a lot of internal politics that play into it. Independent consultants that come in and do this activity are truly unbiased, and we come in and we kind of joke behind closed doors that consultants take bullets from all directions. So we come in with, from what I call a blissful position of ignorance. We can come in and ask questions that are obvious to some but not obvious to us. And so when we go in and say, why couldn't we do this the same across multiple sites, people don't think that we're coming in with some particular bias. From a harmonization standpoint, what we're looking to do is consolidate and normalize. We're trying to break down the arguments that people have to consolidating processes. And we do that in a very unemotional, very pragmatic sense where we come in and ask, okay, look, we see how microsamples are logged in. You know, we're going to go to this workflow, explain why this wouldn't be a good thing for the whole company. So as I mentioned before, we try to abstract those functional needs up to an agnostic level, a level that's not predicated on pre-existing systems or pet pieces of Excel spreadsheets or documents or whatever. And we'll be the first to challenge legacy operations and the origin of them. Why did these things come into play? And it's not a suitable answer just to hear because we've always done it that way. We look at nuances, the differences between some sites. You know, they may require one-off functions, but it's usually less than they think. Again, it's much easier to come in as unbiased consultants that come in and say, look, we don't have a dog in this race. We just want to understand why these things have to be different. In some cases, there are legitimate reasons, but for the most part, if we challenge them, it breaks that down. But if you think about it, in a harmonized case, we're able to reduce the support costs. You're training people on one system. We're frequently going into customers that have multiple sites, and they're using an amalgam of different LIMS vendors and possibly homegrown systems and so forth. So having one system, you can train people to support one system across multiple sites. But also think about this, that sometimes resources, they can pick up and literally move from one site to another and be operating in the same LIMS environment without any training ramp up. So the training is simplified in that respect because you're working off one system, and the risk and liabilities of having multiple systems are also marginalized and reduced. Just an example, I don't mean to strain anybody's eyes here, and this is a very simplified example of a as-is workflow conducted in Visio. In this case, we're looking at some warehouse materials, so raw materials. So people are receiving these things, and the reason all these boxes are white is there's a bit of logic behind it. They all represent legacy process. What is happening in the current state? So we're going through, we're looking, people are trying to figure out if these are priority samples or not, and so forth. We go through and look at these. Now, typically, across multiple work groups, a workflow may involve 50 boxes, 80 boxes, or something like that. And there are multiple work groups. So we're looking at potentially dozens of workflows. Now, if you multiply that across multiple sites, we may be looking at the raw materials or microbiology workflows across many different customer sites. So we have to get to a future state 2B model. Remember, the as-is models are developed in-house, even though we develop the Visio models off-site. The 2B models are developed off-site. And so what we look at here, first of all, process improvement is our first objective. The colors of these boxes mean something. If you look at the yellow boxes, these are automatic LIMS functions. When we redesign the workflow to optimize the work being done, we look at automatic LIMS functions, and then the bluish kind of steel gray boxes are human interaction with the LIMS. So we're defining where these things get done. If you think about what happens is that you have all of these colored boxes. The white boxes will reflect process improvement that we've made that has nothing to do with software. The yellow boxes are how we think commercial LIMS systems can be applied. And then very specific interactions that form the user interface are defined in the blue boxes. Looking at a harmonization example briefly, we looked at 3 different sites. And we found out that, and this is a hugely simplified diagram, but the 2 red boxes say, well, gee, in one site, samples were placed on a sampling table. In another site, samples were picked up from the manufacturing sites by a different group. Okay, we looked at that and said, well, why are we doing it that way? Let's look at, in harmonization, we're going to suggest that everybody has a sampling team, amply trained, and they're the people that interact with the system. They actually do the sampling and pick up, and they deliver the samples to the labs and so forth. So in this case, we've eliminated the differences between the groups, and we've made a harmonized workflow that works across all the different sites. Now, we suggest these things. We're not forcing anybody to do something, but we try to draw people to the wisdom of doing things a certain way. All right. So what happens is all of those colored boxes start to boil down into actual functional requirements. Keep in mind, I mentioned lineage. We'll mention it one last time. The fact that we had as-is diagrams that flowed into 2B diagrams, and from the 2B diagrams we extracted requirements. Those requirements are now linked back to the agreed-upon business needs that we decided upon in the future state environment. So again, when these things get put into a request for proposal document, the vendors are responding to needs that we all agreed are the best way to work for the company. So again, returning to the Astrix approach, after looking at the finalized requirements and the project budgets, our Astrix consultants will develop a customized list of vendors that probably have the best chance of accommodating your environment. We use our proprietary Astrix vendor database. It's full of what we understand about vendors offering solutions. We have a very good cross-sectional understanding of how the vendors are differentiated from one another and what strengths they bring to the picture. The strengths they bring to your workflow could be wildly different than what they bring to even a like operations workflow for a competitor. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is, in the complexities of modern day LIMS systems, nobody uses more than about 70% of a system. Which 70% you use is defined in the future state workflow. So we help develop the request for proposal document. This is targeted in such a way, and the questions are tightened down, that there can be no boilerplate. We don't allow vendors to just say, well, look, here's our boilerplate example of how we do sample logging. Here's our boilerplate example of how we generate barcodes. Here's how we do work assignment. We are asking them to understand that we want to know exactly how they're going to accommodate the customer environment that we have defined in the future state workflows. So therefore, we also define the terms. When we say, can you do this out of the box, we define what out of the box means. If this requires some configuration, we define what configuration means. If this requires customization, we define what customization means. And by the way, when we get to the final project design and so forth, and we're looking for pricing on how to deploy the project, there may be some combination of Astrix or vendor resources or whatever. We want to know the pricing of the entire deployment. And don't say that something is out of the box and then come back with pricing on the actual services component that say, oh, this is going to take 200 hours, not the 20 hours that we originally estimated. So we can provide as much assistance or as little assistance as necessary. A lot of cases, we come in and help divide the vendor demo scripts. So that is the next logical progression from the actual requirements document. when we had the requirements document, recall that the process, we will help send those out to a long list of vendors. We will help read the vendor responses. You know, when we read vendor requirements documents, we read them with a different set of eyes. We'll apply that in just a moment to the whole demo process as well. So we'll help read through those. We will work with you to decide who are the vendors that really have a prayer of doing this. And so we then develop demo scripts and invite a small group, maybe 3 vendors, to come in and demo. So in advance of that, the vendor demo scripts are prepared from the requirements document that we just showed in a few steps ago. So they're coming in and they have to follow a script, the script that ties back to the future state environment. So therefore, when the vendor comes in, they're not demonstrating all the bells and whistles in their product. What they're demonstrating is their ability to accommodate the future state workflow that we've all agreed upon is the best way for you to work. Okay? It's interesting that we often are sitting in on vendor demos, and there's a reason for this. Having sat through these things, we've kind of developed mental calluses to sitting in long, arduous demos. It's very, very exasperating for a lot of customers to sit through these things because they can last 4 to 6 hours a day, and you're frequently doing 3 vendors over 3 days. But even though everybody's tired at the end of a demo, what we do is the first thing that when the vendor leaves, we sit down with everybody while it's fresh in their minds, and we just say, okay, what did you hear? We do provide very consistent apple-to-apple scoring sheets. So everybody's scoring vendors on what they think that they saw and how they felt that they fit to the requirements. But we also want to understand, what did you actually see? And it's not much different than if you worked in the motion picture business and you were a cinematographer. You can't go to a movie without seeing errors in the cinematography and so forth. You don't watch it with the same set of eyes. So it's impossible for a cinematographer to understand how a normal non-cinematographer looks at a movie and sees it. By the same token, we see things that come out of demos. We hear things. And if we're helping with the demos, we may ask for clarification on certain points if we think that some of what is being explained is being glossed over. We want to know specifically. Don't just say that it magically happens with a wave of the hands. We want to understand what's going on. But we really want to understand what appealed to you about a particular vendor's demonstration and what did you see. And we want to explore that because we learn a lot from understanding what you saw. So we can also help when it comes to understanding how vendors derive their pricing, how they present, say, cloud hosting, how they present services, how their maintenance calculations are made, and those kinds of things. We understand every aspect of how services can be presented and so forth. If we can assist in the deployment of the particular product, we will also avail ourselves of those services as well. So what we want to do is be able to help you in every aspect of the project from start to finish. And if you think about it, if we were engaged at the very front end of this, meaning, remember, at the very start of the project, we came in and listened to the 30,000-foot view. And as we started to drill down all the way through bringing those views down to 5,000 feet and then down to ground level where we're doing the as-is environment, we end up with an understanding of the company and all the locations and how they work together. We frequently have an incredibly accurate picture about how the company operates holistically. Not many people in a company take the time to understand how all of the different divisions kind of interlock with one another. By the time we're done with this activity, we do understand. We understand how microbiology gives way to the testing labs, how QA takes that data and releases lots and those kinds of things. We have a very good understanding about the total operation. And so we want to be able to apply that with, given the motivations, given the whole business drivers that were articulated early in the process, we want to be able to come in and apply our new understanding of your environment and make sure that you're successful in this very complex deployment. At this point, Kevin, I'm turning it over for any kind of questions that come up.
Yeah, appreciate that. And thank you for awesome, compelling review, Randy. That's great. A couple of things that come up during that I wanted to let people know is, first and foremost, the slides are going to be converted into a PDF format and sent out to everybody via email. So you'll be able to download those. You just click and you can bring down the PDF version of today's presentation. There also will be a conversion of today's presentation into an on-demand video. So if you have colleagues who wanted to attend today, but for whatever reason couldn't make it, we'll get that out to everybody as well. So you'll have that within probably by usually the end of the week. It takes us to get it to convert it and produce it, etc. It would go out. So I didn't see a lot of other questions that were coming up during the session itself about some of the specific topics, which is fine. Some folks like to ask them during or like to wait after. You can always ask them after when you get a copy of the email, which everybody again will get with the slides on it. If there's a question that you'd like to ask either Randy directly or the company directly, just shoot a reply back. There'll be a gentleman that you can reply to on that email, Michael Zakowski, and just reply to him, and he'll get any questions that you might have answered that you didn't ask during today's session. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Randy, you could probably stop sharing on your side, so we'll stop the recording there. And then, as I mentioned, within the next day or so, everybody, look out for the email with the link for the PDF. And again, thank you, Randy, for a great presentation, and thank you, everybody, for spending a brief hour with us on this fine day. The session is now complete, and have a great afternoon.